Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Sunday, July 13th, day 646 of the war. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Jacob, thanks as always for joining me during your late night and my early morning.
Yeah, and thanks for waking up early to be with me.
It is always a pleasure to see you, Jacob, even at this hour. So hostage release and ceasefire negotiations are at a standstill. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu returned from Washington to Israel late last week. Jacob will recap Netanyahu's U.S. trip and update us on the talks in Doha. Two Palestinians, including a U.S. Palestinian man, were allegedly killed in an Israeli settler attack in the West Bank. The U.S. citizen's family has demanded that the U.S. State Department launch a probe into his death. Jacob will fill us in on what we know today. All of this and more when we're back. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. According to a Channel 12 Israeli television report, later today, Israel will present new maps for the IDF's redeployment in the event of a ceasefire hostage release deal along the Morag Corridor and the perimeter around Gaza after Hamas rejected its previous offer. So to me, Jacob, it appears that talks are at a standstill. And I just wonder if this map of the drawdown is really the main sticking point.
So if you listen to American and Israeli and Qatari officials that I've spoken with, they would sum it up as yes, this issue of how far Israel decides to withdraw during this 60-day ceasefire, that's really the issue right now. Witkoff puts it as it's the last one out of four remaining sticking points. I think that's a little bit oversimplified, but that's how they look at it. And I think there was this extra dose of U.S. pressure while Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Washington to try to get Israel to constrain a little bit more the amount that it wants to stay in Gaza during the ceasefire, because it's still talking about, even after the additional or the updated version of maps that came in last week, it's still trying to remain in about between 30 to 40% of the strip, and basically wants to create a perimeter around the border of Gaza and then create a buffer zone that's between 1 and 2 kilometers, sometimes going as deep as 3 kilometers in the Rafah area, where it's hoping to create that controversial humanitarian city. So the U.S. is trying to get Israel to try to shrink that area a little bit more, hoping that that will be enough to get Hamas on board. Hamas has been pushed to expand what it's willing to agree to. And initially, I spoke with one Qatari official who said that they had moved from agreeing to a 700-meter buffer zone to a 1-kilometer buffer zone. And now I guess the goal in the next round of talks is to try to get the sides to agree. If Israel's at 2 kilometers and Hamas is at 1 kilometer, can we meet somewhere in the middle and get both sides to be willing to move forward? If that's really the thing that's preventing a deal, which is kind of your question, I would be surprised, because I think if that's really all it is, that seems pretty silly. But I think there's still a major political decision that both sides need to make if they're really prepared at this stage to move forward and pause the war.
Okay, so the proposal that they're basing all of the negotiations off of is a Qatari proposal, or is it the Witkoff proposal, the U.S. envoy to the Mideast Steve Witkoff's proposal from, what was it, April, when he rolled that one out?
April, May, that's a good question. It started off correct as something that Witkoff put together. Again, it's all kind of being done together with the other mediators. When that proposal kind of hit a dead end in terms of negotiations, then the Qataris, along with the Egyptians, together made some amendments to the proposal. Didn't really drastically change it, but basically moved it a little bit closer to what Hamas is willing to agree to by spreading out the hostage releases to, instead of all being at the top, to just being spread out to, I think, 5. If you remember the 8 hostages coming out on the first day, and then 2 more on the 50th day, that we're talking about the living ones. So those are the changes that the Qataris and the Egyptians made. But really, it's a joint effort between all the different mediators together.
So it's kind of this Frankenstein-like proposal right now. And the real question, it sounds like what you're asking is there willingness on both sides to actually make the agreement? And of course, the narrative is competing between the both sides, meaning our Prime Minister, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, released a statement last night saying, or his office did, sorry, saying again that it is Hamas that is rejecting everything and putting all the blame on Hamas. And I would assume that Hamas is doing the same thing.
Yeah, I think their point is that arguing that Netanyahu is not really willing to end the war, that he's talking about resuming it at a later stage if Hamas doesn't basically agree to surrender, and they feel that that shows that demonstrates that Israel's not serious right now, and the fact that they want to create this humanitarian city, Hamas is very much framing this as something talking about ghettos. I think concentration camp has also been phrases that either Hamas or their sympathizers are talking about when describing what Israel's hoping to do. Netanyahu and Israel Katz have talked about it. Katz a bit more publicly, Netanyahu privately as well, about trying to moving all the Gazans to, or starting with 600,000 in the Rafah area. And that's something they want to be able to do by holding on to more land during the ceasefire, because if they withdraw from that land, it'll be harder to create that humanitarian city. And I think that's what Hamas is trying to prevent from happening if these talks move forward.
Just to remind our listeners, our Defense Minister Israel Katz unveiled this humanitarian city proposal about a week and a half ago now. And the idea is to raise Rafah, which is basically raised, and then create a new either tent or some kind of semi-permanent construction. And Rafah is obviously so strategic because it is the one outlet for Palestinians into another country, into Egypt. And so the unstated or perhaps also stated desire is to give these Palestinians an option to leave the Gaza Strip voluntarily, is what the line is being taken by the Israelis, at least. And so part of my quandary here is I just wonder what is happening in terms of behind the scenes in the United States. Where do they see these talks moving forward? Because we had this, I would call it the Witkoff card, being played over and over last week, meaning Witkoff is about to get on the plane, go to Qatar, and bring these talks to a conclusion. But as far as we know, where is Witkoff? If you want to play that game, he's not in Doha, correct? So this is a real signal to me of where these talks are right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. He instead of going from Washington to Doha, he went from Washington to Florida, where he basically resides most of the year. It makes obviously lots of trips to Washington, but he's got his golf resort there in Florida. And because the talks, I think that the notion isn't that he's able to simply do something in these negotiations that no other mediator could. Well, he does come with the full force of the president's wishes with him, but really he's trying to go in order to finalize the details. And clearly we're not at a place where they are able to be finalized, and therefore he's holding back. I think we reported a few days ago that he was supposed to leave last Tuesday, really before we even knew that there was going to be a second meeting between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump. And the assumption was that Netanyahu got the second meeting, so therefore we're going to have a breakthrough while he's in Washington, and then Witkoff's going to sprint off to Doha and close the deal. That didn't end up happening. What it seems like is happening in terms of this withdrawal issue, I think, is that Israel wants to have leverage in order to ensure that lean on Hamas to release those 10 extra hostages that it hasn't yet released at the end of the 60-day period. And it feels that if it holds on to more territory, that will ensure that Hamas will, or be more willing to, at least I would say, release those 10 extra hostages. And Hamas is just saying, we're willing to release them if you just end the war, but Israel isn't willing to do that yet. So this is the strategy it's taken, is to try to at least hold on the territory while it can.
Okay, so when our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu set off for Washington, D.C., there was this almost Hollywood-like feeling of optimism that within days, by the end of the week, this deal will be struck. And of course, it could still be struck. We're not saying that there is no deal right now. But where is the sense of optimism at the end of the trip?
Yeah, I think it's not really as much there. If you recall, President Trump talked about it happening this week. Then by the end of the trip, he was saying, well, actually in wars, there's no definite, and was much less willing to give a timeline than he was before. Now, I think 2 weeks ago, he was saying it was going to be the next week. Then last week, he was saying it was going to be this week. There's this I think when Prime Minister Netanyahu made comments in the past on videos about there being breakthroughs that were imminent, and that didn't end up being true, hostage families got very upset at him for trying to lead them on, per se. It's interesting that Trump seems to be avoiding that kind of criticism despite repeatedly being off. And even the fact that the White House announced that Witkoff was going to the region and that hasn't happened yet also, I think, leads to questions about whether we should be trusting every time that they say that there's a breakthrough on the horizon. That doesn't seem to be the case. I think there was definitely, as you mentioned, optimism, but I think it was a little bit misplaced, given that we still had these very real issues at the actual negotiating table. I think it was kind of confusing when I spoke to Egyptian and Qatari mediators who were not nearly as optimistic as Witkoff and sometimes Netanyahu was throughout this past week. And it was kind of like, or two negotiations happening at the same time where I guess you could say that the Washington talks were also quite important, but they didn't really meet the ones that were happening in Doha. And that's why I guess we're not at a deal at this point.
Okay, but that wasn't the only reason that Netanyahu went to DC, correct? There are many other issues on the table, including Syria and all sorts of things, and of course, to celebrate the victory over Iran. So, Jacob, just briefly, can you summarize for us our Prime Minister's trip to Washington, DC?
Sure. I think you're right. The Gaza issue wasn't the only issue that was expected. I thought it was going to be mainly like this Iran strike victory lap that both Netanyahu and Trump would be able to take, because it was such a success in the minds of both the leaders. Trump talks about total obliteration, and Netanyahu has not tried to contradict that by any means. But it was noteworthy that really we only saw, despite there being two meetings, I don't know, I'm not going to say unprecedented, but was not on the initial plan. So that would be a point in Netanyahu's favor that he was able to not just get one, but two meetings with the president. But the first one, there was only a last minute decision, my understanding, by Trump to allow in reporters to take questions. And the focus in the questions was not a ton on Iran. Netanyahu definitely tried to bring up the issue, but the questions went on other things like the question of a Palestinian state, two-state solution, and the Trump Gaza plan. So that it also steered it from Iran. And then in the second meeting that happened on Tuesday, there was no reporters at all. And there was not even really a readout from either side beyond that picture, if you recall, of that the White House released. I think it was where Netanyahu was holding a hat, the red Trump hat that usually says "Make America Great Again," but this one said Trump was right about everything. But beyond that, there wasn't really a press angle or public angle to that second meeting. And the talk, there was this report about expanding the Abraham Accords with Mauritania, possibly their leader meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. That didn't end up happening. There wasn't progress on Syria. There was recognition that maybe there wouldn't be a normalization deal between Israel and Syria, but possibly progress or even an announcement about security arrangements between the two countries, and that didn't happen. So to say that this visit was a dud, I think is not fair to Netanyahu at all, and I think he was trying to, every time he did make a press appearance, and he did make a point actually in responding to reporters' questions in Hebrew, because I think he wanted to push back against this narrative and make a point of saying all this hype in the media about a so-called rift has been wrong, and our coordination is better than you could even imagine. But still, there wasn't this major new announcement that I think we've gotten used to a little bit from each of these trips because of Trump.
Yeah, they're so hyped, of course. And so I think there's a big feeling of letdown in Israel. And of course, the protests against the government and for a hostage release deal continue. And last night was no exception. Okay, we're going to go to a short break and then discuss other matters. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. So over the past day, security forces have arrested 6 people in connection with an incident in the West Bank that took place on Friday, where settlers allegedly killed 2 Palestinians. One of those is U.S. citizen Saif al-Din Kamil Abdul Karim Musalat, and he was allegedly at least beaten to death on Friday in Sinjil, which is a village north of Ramallah. The second man, Mohammed Rizk Hussein al-Shalabi, died after being shot during the attack. The details are cloudy, as they usually are, but Jacob, please describe what you know about this incident.
Sure. So, as usual, you have two competing stories about what happened. But what we do know is that the two casualties in this were the two Palestinian men that you mentioned, and one of them an American citizen. But basically, what's been happening in Sinjil, which has been the scene of repeated settler attacks in recent weeks, is that there is a new outpost that's being created by Israeli settlers nearby. And they're trying to kind of expand specifically onto privately owned Palestinian land that's even straddling Area B, and partially on Area B, which is a place where settlements don't exist. They're all in Area C, which is under Israeli security and civilian control. Area B is under Palestinian civilian control and Israeli security control. But still, settlers, specifically over this past 2 years, almost since the start of the war, have been and moving into places near and into Area B. And that includes this area near Sinjil, where Palestinian farmers were trying to reach, but they've been blocked by Israeli settlers. And what they've tried to do on Fridays is to get together and, I guess, some sort of protest to either some of them to reach their land and work the land, and others to try to push back the settlers who have been expanding their presence there through this, I think you're calling them like outpost farms that they've been creating. And a clash broke out. Basically, Palestinians say that the Israeli settlers were there ready to attack and started throwing stones at them. And the settlers say that the Israeli government also, there was a foreign ministry tweet that pointed out, arguing that actually it was the Palestinians that threw rocks first at the settlers. But this clash, regardless of who started it, ended, as you mentioned, with two Palestinians killed. And there doesn't seem to be an allegation that it was done by Israeli soldiers, and it's probably not Palestinians who killed their own neighbors, but apparently was that these settlers under certain circumstances, they're saying beat one Palestinian to death. The other was shot, but also there was signs of torture. His feet were burned. They don't want to do the family doesn't want to do a full autopsy, which is going to probably complicate the investigation effort. But these two victims, and one of them American, also, I think, adds another layer of complexity to it. A little bit less so with this administration, which I think has been a lot more hesitant in getting involved in Israeli policy in the West Bank. If you recall, on the first day that Trump was in office, he rolled back those sanctions that the Biden administration had put in place a year ago against violent settlers to try to crack down on a phenomenon that they felt that Israel wasn't addressing. Trump administration, basically, the State Department issued this very brief statement saying it was aware that a U.S. citizen was killed, but didn't want to comment any further. And I think that's probably going to be the extent of it. As you mentioned, the family is pushing for an investigation by the U.S. I wouldn't hold my breath on that with this administration, but we'll see. I think this specific incident does seem to be getting more press again because an American citizen was involved. But these have been happening somewhat regularly over the past weeks and months.
Right. And these brush up points on Fridays are, of course, nothing new. They're, maybe even a decade long of Friday protests in a certain place that is very close to the Green Line, very close to where both sides live. But this particular point, Sinjil, I'm not familiar with this particular location. And is this one of those situations where there are these regular Friday protests? And if so, you have to wonder, where is the IDF in this?
So it's a newer place in terms of protest because this is a newer outpost that was established pretty recently by Israeli settlers on top of this Palestinian farming land. What's notable, I think, about this place specifically is that it seems like the attacks or the points of friction and these clashes are happening closer and closer to major cities like Ramallah, where I think a lot of the time these attacks have been more focused on places in Area C that either in the Jordan Valley or targeting people who are a bit the weaker populations, oftentimes Palestinian Bedouins. Now they're going closer and closer to the cities that more Palestinians live in, and it's not just a problem of the quote unquote periphery. And I think that shows in some ways that those who are behind these attacks are feeling emboldened. And it's noteworthy that there were arrests, as you mentioned. I think you said 6. But the question will also be if there's any indictments served, if people are actually convicted, which is a lot less likely. Even though arrests are unlikely, the convictions are even far, far more unlikely.
Right. And the idea of the investigation, because one of these men is a US citizen, is actually, I mean, in my mind, maybe more likely than any kind of Israeli action. Meaning, we have seen in the past that where there are US protesters or US citizens in other matters that they have been killed, we have seen action taken by the US government, in at least in order to investigate it. So it seems to me that the family's request for an investigation is not so far-fetched, but your hypothesis seems to be that the Trump administration will not follow up on it.
Yeah, and even in the Biden administration, there wasn't any example of a U.S. investigation into Palestinian Americans who were killed. What the government tried to do at the time was encourage the Israeli government to investigate. So in the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian American journalist from Al Jazeera, there wasn't an American investigation. While there was assistance from the USSC, the U.S. Security Coordinator in Jerusalem, there was involvement. And then there was a Turkish American national who was killed in a protest, I think, several months ago. Also, no investigation then, I guess, in the previous administration. But again, I think there was just more willingness from the previous one to speak out on these issues, whereas the Trump administration has a different take. What's noteworthy, I think, is that there's a series of attacks that have been targeting a Christian village called Taibe that's not too far away. That has actually gotten more coverage in some of the more evangelical media news sites that are very hesitant to criticize Israel or cover things like this. That now that this Christian village is under attack, they are making a point of covering it. And I think there's an effort to try to get Mike Huckabee, the evangelical U.S. ambassador to Israel, to weigh in on it. And I think there's even a petition that's been put out urging him to speak out about this issue. So far, he hasn't done so. But I think that's a changing dynamic in that evangelical media is covering this issue also in the West Bank.
That's really interesting, Jacob. Thanks for bringing that and all of your other updates today.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
Pleasure. Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.